A gravedigger was sent to bury a body in the dead of winter. It was a simple job, a job he'd done 100 times before, but what he found in that shallow grave wasn't just a body. It was a secret that was still breathing, and that secret was about to change everything. The wind out on the prairie didn't just bite, it tore flesh from bone. It howled through the skeletal fingers of the cottonwood trees, a lonely sound in a lonely land. Mortimer Clang didn't mind the loneliness. He preferred it. He pulled his thin, threadbare coat tighter, his breath pluming in the frozen air like a ghost. The shovel in his hands felt like an extension of his own arms. Down and up, down and up. 6 feet down, 3 feet wide. The ground was frozen solid, hard as cast iron, and every swing of the shovel sent a shockwave up his tired arms. But Mortimer was a stubborn man. Poverty had a way of making a man stubborn, and stubborn men dig graves, even when the whole world is frozen against them. He was just about 4 feet down when he heard it. The groan of wagon wheels, the curse of a tired driver. A sound that didn't belong out here in the middle of nowhere. He stopped, leaning on his shovel, and wiped a line of frozen sweat from his brow. He watched as a rickety wagon crested the nearby ridge, a dark shape against the pewter gray sky. The driver was a silhouette, hunched over the reins like a man carrying a burden heavier than anything in his wagon. He pulled the rig to a stop just a few yards from the half-dug grave. Mortimer watched him, his hand never leaving the shovel. Strangers meant trouble. Always. The man climbed down, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. He didn't say a word. He just walked to the back of the wagon and threw back a heavy canvas tarp. Underneath, a woman lay wrapped in a white burial shroud. Her arms were crossed over her chest, almost peaceful. Dark hair, like a spill of ink, fanned out across the white linen. Even in death, she was beautiful. But it was more than that. There was a defiance in the set of her jaw, a strength that even the shroud couldn't hide. "This her?" Mortimer called out, his voice rough from disuse. The stranger finally looked up. His face was hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. But Mortimer could feel the man's eyes on him. Cold, calculating. "Della Herove," the stranger said, his voice as dry as dust. "Died in her sleep. Family wants it done quiet." Mortimer looked from the man to the woman and back again. Something felt wrong. It felt as wrong as a fox in a henhouse. He'd buried dozens of folks who died in their sleep. They never looked this still. "Where's the death certificate?" he asked. A flicker of annoyance crossed the stranger's shadowed face. "You think I'd haul a living woman 20 miles across this frozen hell?" It was a fair point, but the feeling in Mortimer's gut wouldn't go away. He held out his calloused palm. The stranger reached into his coat and dropped a leather pouch into it. It was heavy, too heavy. The weight of it was all wrong. This was more than payment for a simple burial. This was hush money. "She got people?" Mortimer asked, testing the weight of the pouch. "Don't need 'em where she's going," the stranger grunted. And with that, he climbed back onto his wagon, slapped the reins, and disappeared back over the ridge, melting into the swirling snow like he was never there at all. Mortimer was alone again. Just him, the half-dug grave, and the dead woman. He stood there for a long moment, the heavy pouch in one hand, the cold shovel in the other. He could finish the hole, drop her in, and walk away with more money than he'd seen in a year. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But that feeling just wouldn't quit. He walked over to the stretcher where she lay. The thin burial cloth was damp, and he could just make out the shape of her body beneath it, the gentle curve of her ribs, the pale, elegant line of her throat. He knelt down, his old knees protesting the cold. He reached out a hand just to straighten the cloth. And that's when it happened, a flutter. So faint he thought he'd imagined it. The cloth over her chest moved, just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. Dead people don't move. He leaned closer, his heart starting to hammer against his ribs. He held his own breath, listening. There it was again. Her eyelids trembled. They trembled like the wings of a trapped moth. The shovel fell from his hand, clanging against the frozen earth with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire prairie. She was breathing. It was a gasp, shallow and weak, but it was there, unmistakable. Her lips parted, forming a silent word that only the wind could hear. Mortimer's mind raced. This wasn't a peaceful death. This was something else entirely. With trembling fingers, he pulled back the edge of the burial shroud, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. A necklace of deep, violent bruises circled her throat, dark purple against pale skin. A smear of crusted blood was matted in her hair, just behind her left ear. This woman hadn't died in her sleep. Someone had tried to kill her, and they had almost succeeded. Mortimer stood up, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He looked at the trail where the stranger had vanished into the snow. He looked back down at the woman's face. Her mouth moved again, and this time he heard it, a whisper thin as a spider's thread. Please. The single word cut through him like a knife. A decision had to be made. Right here, right now. He could finish the grave, take the money, and forget he ever saw anything. Or he could help her. He could invite a world of trouble into his quiet, lonely life. The kind of trouble that gets a man killed. He looked down at her bruised face, at the flicker of life in her eyes, and the choice was no longer a choice at all. He scooped her up into his arms. She was as light as a bundle of dry sticks, and her body was colder than the January ground. He carried her away from the grave he had dug for her, the grave that would never be her home. His small, one-room cabin was tucked into a grove of bare oak trees, a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the stone chimney. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He laid her gently on his own cot, the one closest to the crackling hearth. The warmth of the fire seemed to lick at her pale skin, and a little bit of color started to return to her cheeks. He covered her with every blanket he owned. He was standing over her, wondering what in God's name he was supposed to do next, when the back door creaked open. His nephew, 12-year-old Erwin Claiborne, slipped inside, his boots covered in snow and his eyes wide with questions. The boy lived in the next valley over, but spent more time at Mortimer's cabin than his own. "Uncle Mort," the boy whispered, his gaze fixed on the woman on the cot. "You bring home a ghost?" "Close enough," Mortimer muttered, his voice grim. Erwin crept closer. He was a quiet boy, but he saw everything. He looked at the woman, then at the bruises on her neck. He'd seen enough of the world's cruelty in his 12 years to recognize it instantly. "Is she dead?" he asked. "No," Mortimer said, "and that's the problem." "Somebody hurt her," Erwin stated, his young voice suddenly hard. "Somebody hurt her bad." "Somebody tried to finish the job," Mortimer corrected him. He ladled some warm broth from the pot over the fire into a tin cup. "But they didn't count on the ground being frozen solid. Didn't count on it taking so long to dig her a hole." He knelt beside the cot again and gently lifted her head, holding the cup to her lips. As the warm liquid touched her mouth, her eyes fluttered open. They were gray as a storm cloud, and they stared right into his with a startling intensity. He saw fear in them, but underneath the fear, there was something else, a flicker of something that looked almost like recognition. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe here." She tried to sit up, a flash of panic on her face, but she was too weak. Her strength was gone, drained away like water from a cracked bucket. Instead, her hand shot out and gripped his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers like iron bands. Her lips moved, and this time her whisper was urgent, desperate. They'll come back." "Who will?" Mortimer asked, leaning closer. "Who's coming back?" But it was too late. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she fainted again, her hand falling away from his wrist. He was left with nothing but her chilling warning and 1,000 unanswered questions. That night, Mortimer didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, the old Navy Colt he kept under his bed lying across his lap, oiled and loaded. He listened to the soft, shallow sound of the woman's breathing, the only sound in the cabin besides the crackling of the logs. He was a gravedigger. He buried people for money, asked no questions, and told no stories. It was a simple, uncomplicated life. But this was different. This wasn't a body. This was a person who had opened her eyes and dragged him into a story he never wanted to be a part of. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the man who paid him to dig that grave would not be happy to learn that the job was left unfinished. The next morning she was awake. She was sitting up on the cot, her dark hair combed back from her face. She looked weak, but the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet determination. Irwin had left a biscuit and a cup of coffee on the stool beside her, and she had eaten it. The simple act seemed to have given her strength. "You got a name?" "Shucksum," Mortimer asked, keeping his voice gentle. She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting around the small cabin, as if searching for an answer. Then she looked towards the ash pile by the hearth. She slowly, painfully, swung her legs off the cot and knelt on the floor. With one trembling finger, she traced letters in the soot on the stones. Velma. He watched her, saying nothing. As soon as she finished, she wiped the name away with the palm of her hand. "Velma," he said, tasting the name. "Velma what?" This time her finger moved with more confidence. Crispin. Velma Crispin. The name hung in the air between them like smoke. She erased it just as quickly as the first. "Is that your real name?" Mortimer asked. "Or just one you're borrowing for now?" She looked up at him, her gray eyes meeting his directly. "It's as real as it needs to be," she whispered, her voice still hoarse. "Fair enough," he said, nodding. Everyone deserved a second chance at being themselves. He figured that included choosing your own name. For the next 3 days, Velma recovered in the quiet of the cabin. She didn't speak much, but she didn't have to. Her silence was full of unspoken words. With every meal she ate, with every hour she spent by the fire, a little more strength returned to her. She started to move around the cabin, her steps becoming less shaky, her gaze more steady. Irwin took to her immediately. He chattered away to her, telling her stories about his dog and the hawk he'd seen nesting in the tall pine tree, and she would listen with a patient, sad smile. It wasn't much of a smile, but it was enough. It was the smile of someone remembering how to be alive. On the 4th day, Mortimer knew he couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers. He needed supplies. He saddled his old horse and rode into the nearby town of Thistleben. Thistleben wasn't much of a town. It was just a collection of weathered wooden boxes squatting on the prairie, leaning against each other for support. The general store smelled of coal oil, old leather, and stale gossip. The proprietor, a twitchy, nervous man named Jeremiah, leaned across the counter as soon as Mortimer walked in. Jeremiah collected gossip the way other men collected stamps. Mortimer decided to start off casual. "Anyone die lately, Jeremiah?" he asked, grabbing a sack of flour. "Young woman, maybe. Dark hair." Jeremiah's eyes lit up like a firefly in a jar. "You mean the Crispin girl? Velma Crispin?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Hell yes, she died. 3 nights ago. Fever took her. Sudden-like." Mortimer's blood ran cold. He kept his face as blank as a stone. "That's so? Family hold a service?" "That's the peculiar thing," Jeremiah said, leaning even closer. "No service. No notice in the paper. Nothing. Her husband, Victor, just hauled her off to be planted somewhere private. Said she never liked a fuss." Mortimer felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Husband? What's he like?" "Victor Crispin," Jeremiah said, practically vibrating with the thrill of the story. "Married her about 6 months back. Real whirlwind courtship, if you catch my meaning. See, Velma inherited a prime piece of land from her daddy when he passed last year. Best water rights in the county. Victor seemed mighty interested in that property from the day he rode into town." "Where's this Victor now?" Mortimer asked, his hand gripping the flour sack so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jeremiah shrugged, his shoulders nearly touching his ears. "Ain't seen him since the burial. But I heard he's already talking to some land speculators from back east. Moving awful fast for a grieving widower, don't you think?" Mortimer paid for his supplies, his mind racing. He rode home with his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Victor Crispin. The name felt like poison on his tongue. He found Velma waiting on the porch, wrapped in one of his old coats. She was staring out at the horizon, her body tense, as if she expected to see trouble riding towards them at any moment. She was right to be worried. "Your husband thinks you're dead," he said, swinging down from his horse. He didn't see the point in beating around the bush. She didn't even flinch. She just kept her eyes fixed on the distant hills. "Victor is not my husband," she said, her voice cold and hard as the frozen ground. "He's my owner." The words hit Mortimer like a physical blow. "Explain that." "My father died last year," she began, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He owed some men a lot of money. Dangerous men. Victor showed up one day and paid the debt. All of it. But he said the debt wasn't the only thing he was collecting. He said I came with the bargain. She finally turned to look at him, and he saw a fire burning in her gray eyes, a fire that all the poison and violence in the world couldn't extinguish. He married me to make it legal, to get his hands on my father's land. But I wouldn't sign the deed over to him. I kept telling him no. I guess he decided the land would be easier to sell without a wife asking questions. So he poisoned you, Mortimer finished for her. She nodded slowly. He tried. He put something in my stew. It made everything go dark. When I woke up, I was wrapped in that shroud. I could hear him talking to that man, the one he paid to bury me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only listen as they planned my own funeral. Her voice was steady, but he saw her hands, hidden in the folds of the coat, were shaking uncontrollably. If you hadn't dug so slow. But I did, Mortimer said, his voice softer now. He sat down on the porch steps beside her. The cold of the woods seeped through his pants, but he didn't care. The question is, Velma, what do we do now? She turned and looked at him, and the fire in her eyes was now a raging inferno, a cold, determined fury. Now, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, we make him regret ever trying to bury a woman who wasn't dead. That very night, they came. Not Victor. He was too clever, too much of a coward to show his own face. But 3 riders appeared at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the cabin's lamplight. They just sat there on their horses, 3 silent, menacing shadows against the snow. They didn't approach. They didn't call out. They just watched, like wolves studying a sheepfold, deciding the best way to attack. Mortimer stepped out onto the porch, his old rifle held loosely in his hands. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. The message was clear. After a long, tense moment, the riders wheeled their horses around and melted back into the darkness from which they came. But they all knew it wasn't over. It was a warning, a promise. They know, Velma whispered from the doorway behind him. They know I'm here. We can't stay here, Irwin said, his voice trembling slightly. The boy was holding his own small shotgun, his face pale in the moonlight. We're not running, Mortimer said, his voice carrying the flat, unshakable weight of a final decision. He looked at Velma, her silhouette framed in the doorway. Tomorrow we go to town. We go to the courthouse. We file the papers. We make your resurrection legal. Her eyes widened in the dim light. But Victor, he'll find out. That's the point, Mortimer said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like years. It's time your husband learned that dead women can talk, and that the living ones, well, the living ones can fight back. The ride to Thistlebend the next morning was tense. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, muffling the sound of their horses' hooves and turning the world into a shifting landscape of gray and white. Velma rode behind Mortimer, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Her body was rigid, her eyes scanning every shadow, every cluster of trees they passed. But she never once asked him to turn back. Whatever fear she felt was buried deep beneath a layer of cold, hard resolve. The Thistlebend courthouse was a 2-story brick building that leaned a little to the left, as if it was tired of standing up straight. Inside it smelled of dust and old paper. A clerk with a pinched face and wire-rimmed spectacles squinted at them from behind a tall wooden counter. His name was Henderson, and he looked like a man who was terrified of anything that disrupted his neat, orderly world. We want to file a declaration of living status, Mortimer announced, his voice booming in the quiet room. Henderson blinked at him, his pen hovering over a ledger. A what now? This woman, Mortimer said, gesturing to Velma, was falsely declared deceased. Henderson's mouth dropped open. He looked from Mortimer to Velma and back again, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sir, that is highly irregular. So is attempted murder, Mortimer shot back. Velma stepped forward, pushing the hood of her cloak back from her head. Her face was pale but determined, and her gray eyes seemed to bore right through the nervous clerk. I am Velma Crispin, she said, her voice clear and strong, and I am very much alive. The clerk's pen trembled in his hand, spattering a small drop of ink onto his pristine ledger. But you were buried, he stammered, I was supposed to be, Velma corrected him. The difference being, I woke up first. With a steady hand, she reached inside her coat and pulled out a folded yellow document. It was her father's original land deed, the one she'd managed to hide from Victor during their short, brutal marriage. She slapped it down on the counter. I want this property officially and legally returned to my name, and I want the fraudulent death certificate Victor filed to be nullified. Henderson looked from the deed to her face, then back to the deed, his mind clearly struggling to process the situation. Ma'am, this will cause significant complications. For who? Mortimer's voice was low and dangerous, an edge to it as sharp as a razor. For the man who tried to murder his wife for her land? Your husband, as you call him, is a would-be murderer and a thief, Velma finished, her voice ringing with conviction. Now, are you going to file these papers, Mr. Henderson, or do I need to find a judge who will? Just as Henderson, sweating and stammering, began to shuffle through his documents, the courthouse doors swung open with a loud bang. Sheriff Bradley filled the doorway. He was a big man, wide and thick, with small, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His hands looked like they were more comfortable wrapped around a bribe than a pistol. His gaze landed on Velma, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. Well, I'll be damned, he drawled, sauntering into the room. Little Velma Crispin, risen from the grave. I never left it, she replied coolly, not backing down an inch. The sheriff chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Funny that. Your husband, Victor, he's been real broken up about losing you. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear you've recovered. Mortimer stepped forward, placing himself between the sheriff and Velma. Might be he already knows, he said, his eyes locking with Bradley's. The sheriff's smile vanished. You watch yourself, gravedigger. Making accusations like that against a respected citizen, like Mr. Crispin, that can get a man hurt. So can trying to bury living women, Mortimer countered, his voice flat and even. They stood there for a long, silent moment, the air crackling with unspoken threats. The nervous clerk, Henderson, looked like he was about to faint. Finally, Sheriff Bradley broke the silence. He tipped his hat to Velma, but his eyes were cold as stone. You have a good day now, ma'am. He turned and walked out, but not before giving Velma one last look. It was a look that promised this was far from over. The papers are filed, Henderson squeaked as soon as the door closed, frantically stamping the documents with a shaking hand. You're legally alive again, Mrs. Crispin. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Velma took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. That felt like a victory, she said, a small smile on her lips. Felt like we just painted a giant target on our backs, Mortimer replied grimly. He helped her onto the horse. But I suppose sometimes that's what victory costs. They were right. The ambush came when they were halfway home. They were riding through a dense stand of cottonwoods when 5 riders exploded from the trees, guns already drawn, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas. Mortimer's horse reared, screaming in panic, as a bullet whizzed past his head. He fought to control the terrified animal, yelling at Velma, "Get down!" But she was already moving. She slid off the horse's back and hit the ground rolling, coming up with the spare pistol Mortimer kept in his saddlebags. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were focused. She fired 3 times, the shots echoing like thunder in the silent woods. Bam! 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 2 of the riders cried out and tumbled from their saddles into the snow. The other 3, stunned by the ferocity of her counterattack, wheeled their horses in charge. That's when Mortimer's rifle spoke. The powerful crack of the weapon sent another man flying backward, his charge cut short before it even began. The last 2 riders saw it was a losing fight. They yanked their horses around and fled back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. But just before he vanished, one of them turned and yelled, his voice full of hate, "This ain't over, Crispin. Victor will have his land." Mortimer scrambled down from his horse and rushed to Velma's side, checking her for wounds. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, her breathing heavy. She looked down at the 2 men she had shot, their bodies sprawled in the red-stained snow. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a grim sadness. "But they'll send more." "Then we'd better be ready for them," Mortimer said, helping her to her feet. They reached the cabin as dusk began to settle over the prairie. The warm light from the window was a welcome sight, but as they got closer, they saw Irwin standing on the porch, his shotgun held at the ready, his young face etched with worry. He had grown up a lifetime in the last few days. He understood, without needing to be told, that their world had become a dangerous place. "Uncle Mort," he said, his voice tight, "there's something you need to see." He led them not to the house, but to the old barn. And there, carved deep into the weathered wood of the barn door, was a symbol, a crude, angry-looking V inside a circle. The cuts in the wood were fresh, the raw pine showing pale against the gray boards. Velma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Victor's mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He used to carve it on things, on trees, on fence posts, on anything he claimed as his own." Mortimer reached out and traced the symbol with a gloved finger. It was a declaration of ownership, a threat, a promise of violence to come. "Well," he said, his voice a low growl, "he can carve all the symbols he wants. It won't make this his." But that night, as the wind howled outside and the snow began to drift up against the cabin walls, they didn't talk about victory. They barred the doors and shuttered the windows. They all slept with their weapons close at hand. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun, and they all knew that Victor Crispin himself would be coming next. He came with the dawn. Just as the first pale light began to touch the snow-covered fields, they appeared on the ridge. Victor Crispin, riding a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 6 more armed men. He sat on his horse with the easy arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. His face was handsome, but it was a weak, cruel kind of handsome. The face of a man who mistakes privilege for character. He trotted his horse forward, stopping just at the edge of the yard. "Velma!" he called out, his voice dripping with false concern and manufactured joy. "Darling, thank God you're alive. I've been searching everywhere for you." The cabin door opened, and Velma stepped out onto the porch. She was holding Mortimer's rifle, and she held it like she was born to it. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "You searched the grave you paid to have dug?" she called back, her voice ringing out in the cold morning air, steady as stone. Victor's mask of concern flickered for just a second, revealing the ugly calculation beneath. "My love, I don't know what lies this gravedigger has been telling you, but—" "I wasn't told anything, Victor," she cut him off, raising the rifle so it was pointed squarely at his chest. "I lived it." "Now, Velma, be reasonable," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "You were sick, delirious. The fever made you imagine things." "Did the fever imagine the poison in my food?" she demanded, her voice rising with every word. "Did it imagine the bruises on my throat? Did it imagine you leaving me for dead in the back of a wagon?" Behind Victor, his men began to shift restlessly in their saddles, their hands drifting towards the guns on their hips. Just then, Mortimer appeared at the corner of the cabin, his Navy Colt drawn and aimed. From the hayloft of the barn, there came the distinctive, menacing double click of Irwin cocking both hammers on his shotgun. They were surrounded. "Seems to me," Mortimer said, his voice calm and conversational, "that a grieving husband would be a little happier to find his wife alive, a little less prepared for a fight." Victor's laugh was a short, ugly bark. "This man has filled your head with nonsense, Velma, poisoned your mind against me. Now come home where you belong." "I am home," she said, gesturing with the rifle barrel towards the small cabin, towards Mortimer, towards the boy in the barn. "This is where I belong." That's when Victor's composure finally shattered. The mask of the charming gentleman fell away, revealing the monster underneath. "You belong to me!" he screamed, his face twisted with rage. "I paid for you, fair and square. I own you, and I own every inch of this land your father left you. I own it all." "You can't own a person, Victor," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I can own a wife," he roared back. "And dead or alive, that's what you are. Mine!" And then all hell broke loose. The shooting started with a sudden, vicious explosion of sound and violence. Victor's men opened fire, their bullets thudding into the log walls of the cabin. Victor himself spurred his horse forward, drawing his own pistol, his face a mask of pure murderous rage. He was charging the porch, intending to take her down himself, but he never made it. Mortimer's colt barked once, and one of the riders was thrown clean out of his saddle. Velma's rifle cracked twice in quick succession, and another man slumped over his horse's neck, a dark stain spreading across his chest. From the barn, Irwin's shotgun roared, the blast echoing across the yard like a clap of thunder, sending a third man and his horse tumbling to the ground in a tangled heap. Victor was halfway to the porch when Velma's third shot hit him. It caught him square in the chest, the force of it lifting him up and throwing him from his charging stallion. He landed hard in the snow, gasping like a fish pulled from water, his fine coat already soaked with his own blood. The smoke began to clear. Two of Victor's surviving men, seeing their boss go down, yanked their horses around and galloped away, disappearing over the ridge as fast as they could ride. They left four of their own, dead or dying, in the snow-covered yard. It was over. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. Velma slowly lowered the rifle. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard, her boots leaving dark tracks in the pristine snow. She knelt beside Victor, who lay twitching, his life rapidly draining away. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. "The land was never yours, Victor," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "And neither was I." He tried to speak, to curse her, but only a gurgle of blood came from his lips. A moment later, his eyes went glassy and vacant. Victor Crispin had finally joined the ranks of the dead he so eagerly tried to create. Sheriff Bradley arrived 2 hours later, a single deputy trailing nervously behind him. He took in the scene at a glance. The bodies in the snow, the bullet holes in the cabin, the cold, hard looks on the faces of Mortimer, Velma, and the boy. He listened to their story, his face impassive. When they were done, he walked over to Victor's body, nudged it with the toe of his boot, and then looked back at them. He was a smart man. He knew which way the wind was blowing now. "Self-defense," he declared, his voice loud enough for the deputy to hear clearly. "Clear as day. Looks to me like Victor Crispin and his men got what they deserved." Mortimer just nodded slowly. "Clear as that," he agreed, his tone making it plain that any other verdict would have been a very, very bad idea. That evening, they buried the dead. They used the very same grave Mortimer had started to dig for Velma, making it wider and deeper to hold all of them. When the work was done, she stood beside him at the edge of the freshly turned earth, in the exact spot where this whole nightmare had begun. The place where a single, shallow breath had changed the world. "You know what the hardest part was?" she asked, her voice soft in the twilight. "Tell me." "It was realizing I'd been dead long before Victor ever tried to bury me," she said, looking out at the endless prairie. "Dead inside, just going through the motions of living, too afraid to really be alive." Mortimer nodded, understanding completely. "I know that feeling," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been digging graves for so long, I forgot you could do anything else with the dirt, forgot you could plant things in it, grow things." She turned and looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a real smile on her face, a smile that reached all the way to her storm-gray eyes and filled them with light. "Well, Mortimer," she said, "maybe it's time we both remembered. Now, what happened next is the kind of justice you only see on the frontier, the kind of new beginning that's earned with blood and courage. And if you want to see how it all ends, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because this story isn't over yet." Spring came early that year. It was as if the land itself was in a hurry to wash away the winter snow and the memory of the blood that had been spilled on it. Velma's property, watered by the creek that Victor had died trying to steal, exploded with life. Fields of wildflowers bloomed in a riot of color, and the new grass grew thick and green. She and Mortimer worked the land together, their hands once accustomed to the cold, hard tools of death, shovels and burial shrouds, now learned the rhythm of life. They learned the feel of seeds and soil, the satisfaction of turning the earth not for a grave, but for a garden. They planted corn and beans and watched them grow under the warm sun. Irwin was always there with them, his laughter echoing across the fields where only the lonely wind had been heard before. The boy had seen things no child should ever have to see, But he hadn't been broken by it. He'd been forged by it. He had learned about death, yes, but he had also learned about courage. He had learned what it meant to stand up for what's right, to protect the people you love, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. Sometimes in the long, peaceful evenings, the three of them would sit together on the porch of the little cabin, which they had now expanded and repaired. They would watch the sun set over their hard-won piece of the world, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. And in those quiet moments, Mortimer would often think back to that frozen winter morning. He would think about the woman in the burial shroud, the ghost who had come back to life. He had been paid to dig her grave. The first shovelful of dirt he had thrown was meant to cover her forever. But in the end, that dirt had buried someone else entirely. It had buried the man he used to be, the lonely, broken man who lived with his ghosts and his grief, who had forgotten how to live. Velma Crispin, the woman who refused to die, had taught him that resurrection wasn't just for the dead, it was possible for the living too. Sometimes all it takes is someone brave enough to help you climb out of whatever grave you've been put in, or whatever grave you've dug for yourself. As for that first grave, the one he dug out on the empty prairie, it was still there. Empty, a silent reminder under the vast starry sky. A reminder that some stories are too stubborn to end the way they were written. The woman who wouldn't die had saved them all. She had reminded them that breathing is just the start of being alive, and that true freedom begins when you stop being afraid and start fighting back. If you enjoyed this story, do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. It really helps the channel out. And hey, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale from the dark and dusty corners of history. Thanks for watching.